Hello and welcome back. This week we'll discuss the expansion of European states into Africa and Asia that created vast geographical and economic empires and gave birth to the new imperialism that characterized the era between 1870 and 1914. There were many motives for the European expansion, starting with economic gain. Africa and Asia gave Europeans access to raw materials, including tea, rubber, and coffee, none of which can be grown in Europe. These lands also provided Europeans with ready-made markets for the manufactured goods they produced in their newly built factories, often with the raw materials supplied by their colonies. Nationalism also became a driving force for imperial growth. By expanding into other continents, European states could satisfy the nationalist thirst for land and power without having to directly confront their European rivals. Additionally, the nationalism that accompanied imperial expansion into Africa and Asia veiled the class conflict that was surfacing in Europe, keeping a rising working class under the spell of patriotism. This nationalist desire for expansion soon escalated into an increasingly competitive environment. European states saw imperial expansion into Africa and Asia as a way to demonstrate their superiority to their adversaries without having to directly confront them in the battlefield. Missionary goals also motivated Europeans. Just as the Spanish had used Catholicism in their conquest of the Americas, the European imperialists took as their duty the conversion of colonial natives to Christianity. But the European missionary zeal was motivated by more than just religious evangelism. A strong European ethnocentrism drove the desire to civilize the Africans and Asians they encountered. The growing popularity of what came to be known as scientific racism led the Europeans, who were mostly Christian Caucasians, to consider themselves the dominant human race. In effect, their mission was to rule the world so as to improve the racial stock of humanity. As the French novelist and aristocrat Arthur Gobineau claimed in 1853 in an essay entitled On the Inequality of the Human Races, Europeans were scientifically proven to be physically, mentally, and morally superior. But even with all these forces driving them, the Europeans would not have conquered Africa and Asia had it not been for two critical technological advances. First, the development of the machine gun. Second, the crystallization of the chemical quinine. The first portable, fully automatic machine gun, known as a Maxim gun, was invented in 1884 by an American living in England, Sir Hiram Maxim. It enabled a much higher firing rate than earlier designs, up to 800 rounds per second, and made it possible for Europeans to fight much larger contingents of native Africans and Asians, defeating them with ease. However, the most important military advance of the period was a chemical, quinine, which allowed Europeans to survive the deadly effects of malaria disease that had previously struck close to half the Europeans fighting in these areas. With quinine, Europeans could resist the principal threat that had kept them from combat in those regions for centuries, and could concentrate on conquering the lands they so eagerly sought. Technology also influenced European perceptions of the Africans and Asians they colonized. For Europeans, the machines of the industrial age came to represent the true measure of a developed civilization. Whereas the European factory system was glorified as a sign of technological and cultural advancement, the agricultural economies of Asia and Africa were seen as retrograde and crude. For Europeans, the possession of machinery indicated not only technological superiority, but also civilized society, which, in turn, justified their belief in the moral correctness of imperial expansion. Consequently, Africans and Asians were to be treated as primitives who were fortunate to be colonized by the more civilized Europeans. This notion of European supremacy was evident in much of the European literature about colonization. Cecil Rhodes, an Englishman who achieved vast wealth in South Africa by acquiring claims to diamond and gold mines, firmly believed in English racial superiority. He founded the diamond monopoly De Beers, which to this day produces more than 3/4 of the world's diamonds. An African state, Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, was named for him. He also established the eponymous Rhodes Scholarship, the oldest and most prestigious scholarship in the world. In Rhodes' view, not surprisingly, the English were the most racially advanced people in the world. As such, he believed they should govern the world in the interest of civilization and peace. In his famous speech entitled Confession of Faith, written in 1877 at the age of 23, he argued for a secret society that would work toward that goal. It didn't matter what the indigenous peoples of the conquered lands thought, since, according to Rhodes, they were in a state of barbarism. Beliefs such as these earned Rhodes posthumous notoriety as a white supremacist and an architect of apartheid. Nevertheless, the arrival of European influence in Africa and Asia did have its advantages. The most salient were the improvement of sanitation, especially in cities, the adoption of more productive agricultural techniques, and better communications and infrastructure, abetted by the construction of telegraph lines and railways, including the unfinished Cape to Cairo Railroad, a project to unite the northern and southern possessions of the British Empire in Africa, perhaps the grandest scheme of Cecil Rhodes. Nevertheless, the disadvantages of imperialism prevailed for native Africans and Asians. European control quickly put an end to native production of finished goods to ensure that European merchandise could be sold in the colonies instead. Also, subsistence farming, the growth of the basic foodstuffs necessary for survival, was replaced by single crop farming, the cultivation of crops that could be sold in Europe, such as cacao, tobacco, or opium. This raised prices of food for local populations, as foodstuffs had to be imported from other regions. In addition, wages were largely based on ethnicity, meaning that skin color dictated pay. Finally, European colonization led to the destruction of native social and cultural systems as the Europeans imposed their own cultures. So, how did Africans and Asians react to imperialist subjugation? In Africa, most resistance to colonization was put down immediately with brute military force. In Asia, however, story was a little different. There we find three distinct responses, exemplified respectively by China, Japan, and India. China, an ancient empire spanning many centuries, resisted European intrusion in a traditional way through a series of wars, all of which it lost. In the end, China was forced to accept European domination, opening its markets to Western exploitation, including the sale of opium. Japan, on the other hand, pursued a different course and reacted by modernizing and competing directly with Europeans for imperial possessions. The Meiji Restoration, as it was known, transformed the once isolationist nation into a modern empire. By the early 20th century, Japan had become the major imperial power in Asia. Finally, India resisted British rule through the development of an anti-imperialist, nationalist, nonviolent resistance movement led by Mohandas Gandhi. The case of India is perhaps the most important, since its strategy centered on pacifism, running counter to the dominant militaristic strategies of the era. Gandhi understood that Europeans, and particularly the British, would always wield superior firepower over India in a face-to-face military confrontation. Consequently, he developed an alternative approach. He urged his countrymen to boycott British manufactured goods, thus undermining the colonial economy, lowering profits and making it increasingly expensive to maintain imperial control over India. With time, Gandhi's nonviolent strategy paid off. In 1947, India became the first European colony to gain independence, just after the close of the Second World War. In the end, imperialism could not fulfill the grand expectations of the European nations. As the 19th century came to a close, it became evident that colonial expansion had not stabilized relations between the great European powers. Rather than minimizing competition, imperialism actually increased it, raising frictions between competing European nations. In addition, controlling the new imperial markets became more and more costly, requiring more and more troops to maintain order. The so-called civilizing attempts of the Europeans also did not succeed, mainly because the Europeans themselves were in fact not very concerned with the internal development of their colonies, but rather with their exploitation. And in an ironic twist, the same nationalism that motivated the European quest for empire soon began inspiring colonial resistance to the Europeans. Finally, with a continued competition for new lands in Africa and Asia, political tensions among the European powers reached the boiling point, which led quite directly to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. As you research the historical documents for this week, keep in mind another, yet larger context: globalization. European expansion in Africa and Asia was a precursor to the international integration of markets, goods, ideas, and cultures that characterizes our increasingly connected world. Though exploitative, violent, and racist, the new imperialism of the late 19th century brought the world closer together. The questions we need to ask are, first, cui bono? To whose benefit? And second, quo vadimus? Where do we go from here? As I'm sure you suspect, the answers to these questions will lead to our next conversation. Until then, best wishes.